Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's Modern Sales Pros live workshop with Sanj from the team at the founder and CEO, I should say, of the team at Concert Finance. Before we jump into today's programming, Sanj, we just had you on yesterday, so I'm not going to ask you any new hobbies that you've developed since the start of the pandemic. But what I thought was really interesting is actually the location that you're in. Can you just tell us a little bit about where you are physically right now?
I am in a co-working space in Dumbo, Brooklyn. You know, my mask is right here. There's no one else in the room or within maybe 100 feet of me.
Excellent. That's what we like. And is that the one that's part of the Soho house, or have you moved on to upper and bigger and better places?
No, it is. It's not at all that I'm a fancy person. It's really just the closest to my house.
So it's convenience, and you get the high society experience of being at the Soho house. I mean, what could possibly be better than that, other than not being in a pandemic, right?
And I guess like the only thing better is talking about budgeting for sales comp. So
I mean, but I think it's not just budgeting.
It's going to be like a dream come true.
It's making sure that we get the CFO's approval too. It's not just the budgeting part. All right, folks. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. Today is a very special session. This is the second of a two-part session on really setting your organization up with great compensation and having great philosophy and first principles about that. Yesterday's session, which we'll provide the recording to everybody as a follow-up to today's, was more around the psychology of compensation and quota setting and the role that all of that plays in setting really great targets for your team. Today's session takes it in a little bit more of a tactical and a little bit more of an analytical and data-driven direction. And today we're actually going to be talking about how to build consensus and have empathy with the folks on the finance side of the house who are also dealing with budgeting uncertainty. The goal of today, and this is really important, we're going to go through some pretty advanced statistical concepts, or we'll go through a few of them. The goal of today isn't to make everyone that's in attendance a wizard with Excel. That's not the goal. The goal today is to really help you understand and give you some tools in your communication with the finance team for you to work together better in a way that's going to set the organization up for great success, both the sales team and your folks that you have on commissionable plans, and from a business perspective, from a business model. So that's what we're going to be jumping into today. And I'm really excited. Sanj is great with this. We had him on yesterday. This is another great programming that we have today. Before we jump into it, just a few words about Modern Sales Pros for those of you who maybe don't know. Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest community for revenue leaders in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales development, and the related supporting disciplines. Our goal is to create an environment where our community members can answer the questions they'd otherwise struggle to solve on their own. And we do that through bringing amazing speakers in to chat with the community like Sanj today. We also do a lot of online discussions, so you can come and ask questions of the community and get perspective not just from one or two of these organizations, but from 20,000 members that represent over 6,000 different organizations. So really, really great perspective there. For those of you who aren't members, you will be invited to join the community afterwards. And enough about that. Today, I'm really, really excited to be joined by Sanj from the team at Concert. Sanj, I'm gonna hand it off to you, man. Let's jump into this. This is exciting stuff.
Great, thanks, Rich. So just quick introduction. I'm Sanj Sanampudi. I'm co-founder and CEO here at Concert. Concert is a platform that allows you to design your compensation plans and budget for them, and also track your comp within one system. My background is I used to be a CFO, so a lot of what we're discussing today is the stuff that I wish I knew earlier in my career, and this stuff that later in my career people needed to do to make me convinced that our investments were appropriately calibrated.
And one note here, folks, we have Sanj on today for about 45 minutes. So please do, sorry to interrupt you there, Sanj, but please do use the Q&A panel to hop in with any questions that you may have. especially as it relates to what we're talking about today. Sanj is really keen to answer as much as he can while also going through the programming. Sorry to interrupt, Sanj.
Yeah, no, that's really important. A lot of what we're talking about today is going to be really new and unfamiliar to people, so please ask questions. You know, as Rich teed up, like what we're talking about today is really your budgeting process and how to make it more seamless. You know, I remember times earlier in my career where it would just take like months to budget the top line and to come up with comp plans that would work. And then even after we finalized all of that stuff, it took like 3 more months for whatever reason to do the last tweaks to comp plans and get them out to the team. So even though we started a new year on January 1, the team got their comp plan in like March or April. I'm sure none of you are as bad as I was. But our goal is, how do you take that like kind of horrible exercise and time box it into a couple of days? Because really, this shouldn't be that hard. So our agenda is we're going to talk about how we budget today and where we see it go wrong. Talk about like the uncertainty. You know, the core of budgeting is you're trying to predict the future, and like spoiler, you're all going to be wrong. So how can you accept that uncertainty and harness it to create a more productive process? We'll then go into the technical part of the webinar today, which is what Monte Carlo simulations are and how they apply to sales comp, and then give you a couple of takeaways. So jumping in, a rough guide of how budgeting works today. You know, there are 2 houses in Fair Verona. There's the finance team and the RevOps team. And, you know, the budgeting process usually starts because an investor is like, you're growing by 30% next year. And finance is, you know, kind of moving it around across teams to figure out, well, how could we efficiently deliver that growth? And the RevOps team is then looking bottom up and they're like, yeah, that's not happening. How do we fill these gaps? And the RevOps team then kind of takes those gaps and builds a real capacity plan. So you're talking about hiring and ramp times and attrition modeling. You're first starting to think about compensation at that point, and you're also probably layering in enablement and tools, because a big piece of filling in those gaps is usually addressing the fundamental productivity challenges. With that capacity plan, it gets passed back to finance, and that's where like the really fun Excel financial modeling, you know, cash flow impacts and accounting all happen. And then, you know, the budget doesn't work. So in the finance role, we really look for ways to de-risk expense. So how do we make more expenses more contingent? How do we pay even less in low cases? Well, how do we balance out paying a higher amount in low cases by paying less in the high-end cases? You're really spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to make that balance happen. And that is the one single point where we acknowledge that nobody knows how the future is going to pan out. And that's really kind of like the crux of where we see the problem in this process right now. And then, unfortunately, those of you in RevOps are left holding the bag, and you got to sell it to the sales team. So you have this like kind of monster of a comp plan that in many regards looks unattainable to reps. And if you remember from yesterday's session, you know, the targets are the thing that matter the most to your rep. The targets are the key to increasing your productivity. And you're somehow kind of explaining like this totally disconnected from a rep's experience comp plan is suddenly a great thing for them. And then, you know, invariably it will have some cascading impacts, and you might find yourself with a problem with attrition. So how do we break out of this cycle? We say that you should embrace the uncertainty. As a few of you know, I'm really into the psychology of all of this. So, you know, the way we think about uncertainty is as human beings, it's wired into us as part of our survival instinct. So anytime we face an amount of uncertainty, we automatically create negative simulations. So the way uncertainty was tested with a bunch of subjects in Germany is people were dropped off at a dark alley and they were told to walk through the dark alley. And when people were told to just walk through this long dark alley in a dangerous neighborhood, they tended to have their head down. They tended not to interact with their surroundings at all. They just were kind of really, really paralyzed. They couldn't really understand what was going on around them or the context of their situation. So really, that uncertainty forces people to shut down. But we also know that there are examples where we actually embrace uncertainty. We're really excited to participate in uncertainty. And that's like, imagine a large jackpot and buying a lottery ticket, and you're signing up for it. You're excited for that uncertainty. And that's really where we see the potential. So a lot of our budgets are like, ah, crap, like 2021, we're walking into a dark alley. And what we need to make it feel like is like, we're buying a lottery ticket. We really can do this. And we just need to work together to set ourselves up for success. So uncertainty comes from three main sources. Complexity, which is how many interdependencies in your model are there. So if this, then that, if this, then that, if this, then that. That's kind of what we're looking for in complexity. Ambiguity is you can have a very large range of outcomes. So, you know, what happens if I close $0? What happens if I close $1 million in a month? And then probability. So this is the piece where I think we probably do the worst job today, collectively as finance and RevOps, of ascribing, like, how likely is it that this outcome is to come to fruition. And based on the interaction of these sources, you will create either negative or positive simulations. Negative simulations are usually multi-sourced. So you usually are trying to de-risk something or like extraordinarily place focus on a negative outcome if you have a few of these factors at play. So, you know, in comp planning, we'll see that complexity and ambiguity are really relevant to teams. You know, we don't want really complex comp plans. We also don't really know how the team is going to perform. And that's where we focus our efforts. In that dark alley example, again, the simulations are probably more around probability and ambiguity. I don't know what's going to happen in this alley, and I don't know how likely there is that something bad is there. In the center of all of this is decision paralysis. So if you kind of have had those budgeting conversations where no one is making any decision at all, no one's saying if it's a good comp plan, no one's saying if they're going to sign up with the number, it's because these three factors are all at play pretty equally. Another way to think about decision paralysis is like this is like COVID back in April, when people weren't buying, when people weren't making decisions, when people weren't moving forward with their lives. And it was really because there was a very clear lack of information across the board. So like, you know, we had a bunch of complex metrics that no one knew how to interpret. There were kind of conflicting reports on the ranges of outcomes that could happen. And really no one knew the probability of kind of bad outcomes. We still don't know a lot of it, but we do box those a little bit better a few months out. Positive simulations are really different because they tend to have one primary source of risk. So back to that lottery example, you're sort of capped on the downside of buying a lottery ticket. A lottery ticket costs, like a Powerball ticket costs $2. Like, you're capped at losing $2. Yes, there are a range of outcomes, but like, it's not that ambiguous. You might lose $2. The really relevant thing to your decision is the probability. Are you going to win or not? And what chance do you have? And this is really where Monte Carlo simulations come in. You can build simulations to kind of attack all three of these factors at the same time. For those who don't know and aren't familiar, a Monte Carlo simulation is a statistical tool that creates a bunch of randomized simulations to your results to give you an idea of what the range of outcomes looks like. So this is helping you understand across 1,000 different randomized scenarios what the world could look like.
And just to reiterate what we had said at the beginning, folks, we're going to get into some of this statistics and how this is practically applied now. The goal of today, as Sanj had said at the beginning, we're not trying to make everyone on this call an Excel wizard. These are things that will help you have a better conversation to de-risk and disambiguate some of that uncertainty as you're negotiating and building in partnership with finance comp plans that are really going to move the needle for the individuals in the sales team and put your organization in a position where it can run a nearly responsible business.
Yeah, and we also are going to be sharing some materials on how to do this in Excel. So don't become an Excel expert if you're not one already, but share those materials with your finance team and they can probably figure it out, or you can email someone on our team and we're happy to talk you through it quickly. So how are you going to use this to attack the sources of uncertainty? The first is you can model complexity. There is a big myth that comp plans need to be simple, that you need to have, you know, no more than 3 factors or, you know, no more than 2 rates. Like, no. Your comp plans need to match the behaviors that you're looking for. And there is some truth to how much you should focus someone on. You know, you're using this to focus and motivate your team. You can only point them in so many directions. But they can have multiple elements. We see a lot of very successful comp plans where people are paid on sourcing some amount of their own pipe. They're paid on closing deals with accelerators, and then they have a few kickers. That's totally normal, totally acceptable. The important piece is that you build that into how you're modeling. So you incorporate all of those pieces into your model so that there isn't kind of like this unaddressed question, well, what about this one thing you didn't put in the model? The second piece is to model ambiguity. And this is probably the most challenging to calibrate correctly. It's really easy for our businesses to talk about averages, but averages hide a lot of what is not going right in your process. So we treat averages as our enemy in this. And instead of averages, we look for ranges. And to add a little bit more granularity to the ranges, we actually look at the ranges across multiple stages of your sales process. So we don't just take you to the place where you're saying like, oh, my team usually closes between 5 and 25,000 a month. It's really layering in the variability in leads, the variability in conversion rates, and the variability in sales cycle to give you a really robust view of like how variable your sales process really could be. When we're talking about negative versus positive simulations, this is your single source of uncertainty. There is not really a great way that anyone can make your sales process really, really predictable. You're always going to have to live with these ranges, but by modeling it into your process, you can actually, you at least are acknowledging them. And that will, in a way, diffuse them for both you and your finance team. So the final step is you're going to model the probability, and that's where the Monte Carlo comes in. So you're taking the inputs of your old plan, your new plan, and all of your close ranges, and then you kick out a curve of what your old plan versus your new plan would cost. And the way that this is going to like superpower your planning process is first, in like normal life, your budget is one single point on this curve. It's like really sad. It's like pretty pathetic. Don't do that. Because what you get when you draw out the curve and you acknowledge the variability in performance when you're modeling in the uncertainty is you get a much more nuanced view. In this view, we can see that there's a 50% chance approximately of closing between 16.5 and 16.75 million based on this plan. And we also know that the range that it could cost you is somewhere between 1.6 and 1.8 million. That range could be acceptable. That range could be a little bit high. And then you really know what you need to work on. You know, that's where you're able to kind of change your plan's features a little bit to tighten that range if that's really important to your business. The last things that you're able to see is are you incenting the right outcomes? So, you know, we recommend that people look for a few different elements. The first is the shape of your curve. Is your payout matching your performance? So are we paying high commissions in high ARR scenarios and low commissions in low ARR scenarios? Great. Is it steep enough? So this is really kind of specific to your business and how prescribed your sales process is. But some payout curves end up being a little bit flatter because you're paying more for your reps to figure out the sales process, and a little bit there's a little bit less predictability in the process itself. As I mentioned before, you're looking at the width of each line to see, you know, is this a range of payouts that we can accept? And then finally, you would look for any outliers. So where are the cases, you know, maybe like this one here, where you're paying a lot in commissions for an okay result?
And Sanj, I think that's a great point, and it's a question that comes up a fair amount. We had it a little bit in registration as well. How can we use this to get a better understanding and sort of better control the cost of compensation for our folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a few things you can do on kind of the plan design side. You know, one of the questions we regularly hear when we're working with customers is, oh, I have this person who massively overachieved. They're getting, you know, $1 million in commissions this year, like literally $1 million in commissions this year. Like our board is saying they can't do that again. How do we solve that? And in that case, you know, one tool you can use to solve it is instead of having annual quotas with annual accelerators, move to quarterly quotas with quarterly accelerators. So the person who got to their annual kicker in month 2 and was making, 30% of every deal after that is now only going to get 30% of every deal for 1 more month. So, you can definitely play with the time horizon. The trade-off of playing with the time horizon, though, is actually your width is going to increase. There's just more variability if you have 4 quotas for every person versus 1 quota for every person. There are also ways that you can play with the accelerator tiers. So one way to solve cases where in low scenarios you kind of want to balance them out and pay a little bit less is to introduce decelerators to your plan. And you can then true up those decelerators by making your accelerator tiers retroactive up to 100%. So there are kind of technical ways to work with your comp plan, and then fix the shape of your curve to fit what you really need to accomplish in your business.
No, that's great. I was just putting my sales guy and sales gal hat on, and he starts talking about decelerators. And that's a tough sell. That's a tough sell to get in there, though.
Yeah, I think decelerators are never anyone's favorite thing, but there is, if your process is fairly clear, if your quotas are really attainable, people are going to focus on the accelerators.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sanj.
Oh yeah, it's really about tying back to yesterday's presentation. If you're building something that a comp plan that people have confidence in, and they're confident that you built it so that they are successful, they're not going to worry about the decelerator as much.
Yeah, I think it's something where there's that, which crowd are you a part of? Is it a coin toss of if you're going to be successful or not, where maybe only 50% of the team is at quota, or like we talked about yesterday, is it 80, 85, 90% of the team can hit quota? Then you're like, ooh, I'm not really worried about the accelerators there.
Exactly. Great. So the end result of doing this analysis is your complexity is built into your model. Your complexity is built into your financial model. It's not the typical shortcut that we hear of, oh, the top performers and the low performers are probably just going to wash. That's not going to happen because the low performers are going to book 0 in the worst case, and they have a floor. Your top performers have no floor. It's never going to wash. So your complexity is taken care of here. Your probability is taken care of because you have now 1,000 scenarios. You understand the probability of these outcomes. So what's really open is the ambiguity. And is the past a reasonable predictor of the future? And that's something that you're going to have to answer individually. In most cases, yes, it is, but that is one for your business. So some takeaways. The first is how do you do Monte Carlo simulations in Excel? This is a very high level view. We'll again send a little bit more detail on how to create this for you to share with a Excel enthusiast analyst on your team. But the key function to know about is rand between. And that gives you a randomized number between 2 numbers, and it will keep recalculating. You would link that random number to the plan formulas that you've designed. And then you can run a function called data tables, which would then randomize 1,000 times. It's not particularly challenging for people who are really into Excel. It is not worth learning Excel this well if you don't know it that well. And then, so we kind of showed how we think budgeting should work. What we wanted to show is a rough guide of how budgeting works today in our process. So when we're working with customers, we start with the bottom-up ranges. You know, I mentioned the past is the best predictor of the future. It's a uniquely human attribute to try to think that the future will somehow be different when you haven't seen it in the past. Like, other animals don't do that. So we start with the past. And you take that and you start building your Monte Carlo. So what you're doing is you're front loading all of the uncertainty. You know exactly what happened in the past. Now let's see if that variability plays out again in the future. You then would take that variability and see where your most likely outcomes are and work on your capacity planning. So how many people do you really need to hire when you factor in the variability? Again, how do you play with those comp levers? And what enablement and tools should you be investing in? You know, knowing how far you might be. Then you take that into your financial modeling, kind of the same cash flow work. And once it's in your approved budget, you can sell it to sales. What you notice about our workflow is it looks more integrated. So it's not like finance does their work and then passes a spreadsheet over to RevOps, who then do their work and pass the spreadsheet over to finance. This is you're working off of the same numbers all the time. And you're passing it back and forth. This is a real partnership, purely because you are working on the uncertainty together. So with that, I think I might have finished in record time. Any questions?
I think that was great, Sanj, and John Simo actually asked a question that you answered in the previous with just that back and forth. It really is a collaboration between the two groups, as opposed to it being something where finance does their thing, RevOps does their thing, and they kind of come together.
Yeah, and one thing that so when we do this professionally, like, we would never just start with one group. We have both groups in the room at the same time. And I think that builds a lot of trust in the process.
And the question, I know, I'm sure a lot of folks are seeing this and sort of thinking about this, not finance versus sales or finance versus RevOps, but really working together. As a recovering CFO, if I were an ops person, what's the right way to approach the finance team with a more collaborative approach?
Yeah, I think you know, it sort of starts with acknowledging what didn't work or what doesn't work, and building a path to getting budget out. From the RevOps perspective, and even from the finance perspective, I think the thing we most often see is like a symptom of how broken the process is what I mentioned early on in my intro of, like, if you're getting your sales team their comp plans really late, the process is broken. And if you kind of start with like, hey, legally, we're not supposed to give our comp plans out that late. Let's solve this right now and build a calendar to work together. I think you can start having a more open conversation of like how to work together and how to improve the process.
I think that's a great point. And folks, as we said in the chat panel, we've got Sanj for about another 10 minutes here. So fire away. This man knows more about compensation than most of us have forgotten. In terms of using this, and one area where I remember being in a, let's call it tense environment with the finance team was actually around that hiring component of capacity planning. Can you maybe talk through a little bit about how this makes that conversation a little bit easier, or at least a little bit more all the cards are on the table?
Yeah, I think what is challenging to know, at least from the finance perspective, is like, can a territory actually support another person? So if your individual rep productivity is already not where it is or where it needs to be, does another person actually deteriorate that further? Or is another person going to be like way better than the team that already exists? How is that actually helping? And I think when you're starting from this place of acknowledging the variability, you're actually kind of going in eyes wide open of like, well, you know what? We might not have the most efficient team right now, but we actually need this person because we're going to miss our number. And this person is going to be cash flow negative, cash flow positive by the end of the year. You know, like you'll kind of have a really clear view of like, what is this person going to contribute? Because and that's a good point, those ramp-up assumptions would also go into those ambiguity levers that you're putting in.
Yeah, and I think that's another area too, just as we're talking about that. I think one of the things that's interesting is looking at investments that you can make to adjust some of those ambiguity levers. So back to the demo to, or first call to demo ratio, let's say, right? That's something where you could invest in sales enablement or tooling or training to try to control that, or at least increase the floor or the average a little bit to put you in a better position to get to where you want to get to.
Yeah, I think you're trying to minimize the variability there, right? Like make each, you know, when I think of RevOps, like, you know, I always kind of go back to thinking like, there are the people who work at Toyota figuring out how to improve the factory line. So, you know, if you have a 3x variability in the production of a Camry, that's totally unacceptable. That's how you fix productivity. Yeah. So yeah, I think like these ranges will take a little work to get to, but they also will help you prioritize the investments you're making.
And we have actually another question coming in live on this. You mentioned, you know, we've got kind of some of the basics here that I think every sales leader would think of if they sat down and wrote this out on a napkin. Are there other metrics that you would model into this ambiguity side of things?
You know, I think they're very they're very specific to each company. I would say at a high level, these are probably the most straightforward. I would probably add in something around like the sourcing of these leads. I think there are a fair number of studies that show that sales reps have much higher close rates when they source their own deals. So that would be a more nuanced way to look at it of like, well, what if we actually created an incentive around participating earlier in the pipe?
Yeah, interesting. So with that, and I'm just going to kind of piggyback on that question, Sanj, would I actually have multiple variants of this table and then run various Monte Carlo simulations based on the percent of pipeline that came from maybe a partner versus self-sourced versus inbound? Or would that just be another component on here?
That would be another component in here. So what you're doing is in this ambiguity section, you are throwing in everything that makes you a little bit uneasy about your process. And this is like what the average hides though, right? This is why the average is so bad, because the average is not actually a data point that you've probably ever observed in the wild.
Right. Yeah, no, I can think of some modeling that I've even done recently with this, where it's like, the average is, it's kind of in between those two, but in reality, you've got these extremes to contend with here. Another question coming in, more just around the Monte Carlo simulations. When you kind of run that, have you ever seen someone do this on maybe a per rep basis or a per title basis? So in some organizations, right, you've got AEs and then strategic AMs or something like that. Have you seen that done before?
Yeah, so we recommend running this by kind of plan or role. At an individual rep level, it's not entirely as valuable because statistically randomizing one person leads a normal distribution. But it is more interesting to do it in aggregates of people. What you get from randomizing one person, though, is you get a clear view of their payout curve for them. So what we end up suggesting is you can actually use this curve and draw it out and say, like, all right, this is how you get paid. This is like, you know, depending on where you individually end up on this curve, you would either be here or here, and you see what the high and low scenarios are worth to the individual.
Interesting. I never thought of kind of running that on a, hey, here's where you could be basis. So one more question coming in here, Sanj, longtime Modern Sales Pros member, I think one of the OGest of the OGs, Damian Wisniewski, asking about kind of the hygiene question. So if we go back to that modeling of ambiguity, Damian's point is, if I have a rep that's terrible at Salesforce, how much does that screw this up? And the example he gives is, you know, maybe just very, very low lead to demo ratio, but really high demo to, you know, demo to close one ratio, because they don't put anything bad in Salesforce. How do you contend with that?
Yeah, I would say instead of using this to solve your problems, I would argue that this is a lot better than running on an average. I think if your data is a thing you're concerned about, the average is even more harmful to your calculations.
Interesting. Yeah. So that would, to Damian's point, right, that would kind of not be blended away by looking at the average, right? You'd have the extremes modeled through this.
By looking at the ranges, you do have some notion of what the extremes would look like. And if one person is bad at that specific activity, you have everyone else who kind of gives you a better idea of the range. Whereas if you're using a blunt average, that one person's number is going to equally adjust everyone else's number.
Oh, that's great. Sanj, I think we're at about time here. Once again, this was really, really awesome. I really appreciate the deep dive here, and I know our attendees certainly do, as do all of the members of the Modern Sales Pros community who are going to be watching this in the coming weeks and months. And for those of you who want to dive in a little bit deeper here, afterwards we'll share both yesterday's session on more of the sort of quota setting and thinking about that from a psychology standpoint, today's session, which will help you sell to your CFO and work better with finance. In addition, for those of you who are in the midst of annual planning, not next week, the week afterwards, we have our 2021 Modern Sales Pros Vision Week. This is your one-stop shop for annual planning. If you haven't started, if you're maybe just getting into it, if you feel like you're a veteran, but you need to improve a skill somewhere, maybe around territory design, or Sanj is running a session on like great comp plans and really what they look like. So you're gonna have an opportunity to hone all of those skills. Concert's a great sponsor, and Sanj will be speaking there again. I'd encourage you to attend that as well. And there's the link in the chat panel. But Sanj, as I said at the outset, it's always a pleasure to have you join us on Modern Sales Pros. I think it's always a great experience for us to think bigger and broader and maybe ahead of where a lot of us are today. And that's why we love having Concert as a sponsor and love working with you.
Yeah, thank you guys. Happy budgeting. And if anyone needs help with advanced Excel skills, find me on LinkedIn.
Oh, Sanj, on behalf of all of our attendees here today, the 20,000 people in the Modern Sales Pros community, and Hannah behind the scenes, thank you so, so much. We look forward to doing this again sometime real soon.
Yep. Bye.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Bye-bye.